Good morning to those who are joining right now. The audio is working. We're just getting the recording going and the slides up, and we'll get going shortly.
All right. All right. Well, hello, and thank you all so much for joining us for this kickoff call for this year's grants. My name is Sarah Joss. I am one of the grant managers in the Strategic Partnership Department, and I am joined by Rachel Nygaard, who is the director of our department. Another name that you might be familiar with is Angelyn Johnson. She's another grant manager, but she's not able to join us today, but know that she is going to be our other team member who you will be working with regularly on these grants. So because of the size of our group today and to make the best use of our time, we aren't going to have everyone introduce yourself, but we would love it if you would drop your name and the organization you're representing in the chat at this time so that we can all see who's here. And if you want to put your position within the organization in the chat as well, please feel free to. A couple quick items of housekeeping before we begin. We're going to send a copy of these slides out after the session so that everyone has access to them, and we are also recording the session. So if any of your colleagues weren't able to make it and you want a copy of the recording to share with them, just let us know. Here is the list of early childhood grantees for this year. So as you can see, we have 15 organizations and a lot of individuals registered for today's call. But we do want to acknowledge, even though we aren't going around the room to have everyone introduce themselves, that relationships are really at the heart of what we do, and connections between our organizations are invaluable. So please notice the many different agencies represented here. And it's a really impressive group working on a lot of really exciting and impactful projects. So stay tuned for opportunities later in the year for opportunities to connect. Here is our agenda for our time together. And the most important items for us to discuss are related to the contracts, which is the way that Buncombe County structures grant awards. In that section of our agenda, we'll get into the important details about how to access the grant funding that you've received. So we'll highlight some information about reporting and contract monitoring, and we'll leave you with next steps in order to successfully launch your projects. We've also built in some time for questions and answers at the end. So if you think of questions between now and then, please feel free to drop them in the chat box or write them down and save them for later to drop in there. And we will do our best to make sure that we are answering all of those. Buncombe County currently has 9 grant programs, partnering with community organizations across various domains in alignment with county priorities and goals. So a very important website for you to jot down if you're not already familiar with it is buncombecounty.org/grants. On this website, you'll find details about the program, such as the grant guidelines, awards, performance reporting, committee information, and much more. So from that site, you can also get to other county funding information, such as COVID recovery funding, aging services grants, community recreation grants, and more. The purpose of the early childhood grants is to advance the county's strategic priority to ensure that every child in Buncombe County has an equal opportunity to thrive during their first 2,000 days, including access to quality early childhood education. So here is a snapshot of our FY24 grants. As you can see, we have what was requested from this year's grant cycle and what was actually funded. So the committee did a really wonderful job of making sure that we were funding as many projects as possible, as much as possible. So please note that the 21 projects that were funded, including yours, were all awarded 100% of their request this year. And something to note, the Early Childhood Education Fund has been converted very recently to a multi-year fund beginning for FY 2024. So this will make it easier to reallocate and reinvest any unused funds from each year. However, the carryover funds from FY23 will be slightly delayed, likely late August or early September. And the organizations who were originally notified of a partial award will receive full funding this year, but it will require a contract addendum once the funds are allocated in August or September. So stay tuned on that.
We may have found a method that we will be able to put it all on the contracts from the start, but we're not exactly 100% confirmed on that. So if we do need to come back with an amendment, thank you in advance for your patience.
So this is a nice little representation of our funding cycle. And here we are approaching July 1st, which is an important date because it's the start of our new grant period. Your funding is to support the 12 months of our fiscal year, which is July 1st through June 30th. And county staff are working hard to equip you to be ready to get going on your grant projects as soon as possible, starting on July 1st. So the first step is to establish contracts, and we'll be moving into that in just a moment. But first, I wanted to take the opportunity to share some new information about organizational strengthening that we have some new resources and tools available for. The county is committed to supporting organizations throughout the community investment grant process. And this year, we are rolling out brand new resources and tools to assist organizations in navigating the public funding landscape to ensure that all grantees have the support they need to be successful in managing our community investment grants and beyond. So some of these new resources include a board member guide to public funding, nonprofit insurance overview, which will provide some additional information about the different insurance requirements and what purpose they provide, a finance guide and workbook that takes you step by step through everything from financial statements to budgeting and risk to internal controls and compliance. There are also accompanying financial practices videos, which we highly recommend that your organization take a look at. These go hand in hand with the finance guide and workbook, and each module gives an overview of the different components. There's also the North Carolina Secretary of State Nonprofit Compliance document, which provides information to help you navigate your organization's charitable solicitation license or exemption requirements. And again, you can find all of these resources on that main grants page, buncombecounty.org/grants. If you scroll down below the community investment grant buttons, you will find our organizational strengthening resources and tools section. And if you want to take a deeper dive into these new materials and how to utilize them to your advantage, we are going to be hosting a new grantee orientation call on Tuesday, July 11th. That's going to be at 3 p.m. And even if your organization has received funding from the county before and you'd like a refresher, or you have a new team member who's going to be working on managing grants this year, we invite you to attend. So you can email Angeline to sign up for that. So now I'm going to hand it over to Rachel to review contract materials.
All right, thank you, Sarah. And if you would quickly put Angeline's email address in the chat, we welcome anyone to attend that session. I was looking at the list of organizations, and I think all of the organizations represented on this call have done business with, oh, you don't need to do that. You're screen sharing. That sounds complicated. We'll make sure you have Angeline's email address at the end of the presentation. So great news that most of the organizations on the call are familiar with the contracting process with Buncombe County, and it's helpful for us to go through as a refresher and remind ourselves of all of the different steps and components involved in contracts. So this is some of this information is fairly technical, and thank you for being here to receive this information. I'd like to start by saying thank you very much for your responsiveness in communicating with us so far about these contracts. We also are committed to being as responsive as possible so that we can get you and your organizations to a fully executed, that means signed on both ends, fully executed agreement as soon as possible so that you can have the necessary authority and funds in hand to get off and running with your work. Many of you have already received a copy of your draft contract. However, don't think just because we've sent you a copy, it can't be changed. Much of what is in the agreements can be adjusted. Just ask. So now I'll walk through the elements of the contract. You can see here that contracts, the requirements that we follow come from County Commissioner resolution. And this is the mechanism that Buncombe County uses to get the funds to grantees. The resolution referenced here from our Board of County Commissioners says that we're to establish contracts that contain certain elements like financial assurances, insurance provisions, payment details, the scope of work, and reporting requirements. And we'll go through each of these on the next few slides. One of the elements is nonprofit financial assurances. As described in the grant guidelines, we collect certain financial assurances for nonprofit organizations that receive grants. If your organization is not a nonprofit, this will not apply to you, but for those that are, the required documentation includes the most recent IRS Form 990, your tax filing, as well as your financial statements, sometimes referred to as your audit. However, financial statements are on a tiered structure, and this follows the size of your nonprofit organization. So as you can see listed on the screen here, organizations with annual revenues of $300,000 or greater are at that audit level, but there's also a review and a compilation level for smaller organizations. We can review your situation on a case-by-case basis to determine whether you qualify for a waiver if you are not able to submit the level of financial statements requested. We try to be as flexible as possible in coming up with other ways to provide the documents needed. Insurance is also something that's pretty specific. Buncombe County requires organizations to have the appropriate insurance for what they do for the funded work. And we receive guidance from our risk management office about the level of insurance to request depending on the nature of the work being conducted. So when you receive your draft contract, you'll see a section listing which insurances are requested for your project and the minimum amounts of coverage that are needed. If you do not feel it's necessary to carry the amount being requested, just ask. Please let us know so that we can look into it with you. We've listed here some common types of insurance that you might see. You'll notice that commercial general liability insurance is bolded. At the very minimum, all organizations receiving county funds are required to carry general liability insurance that names Buncombe County as additionally insured. You should be able to contact your insurance provider to request this additional insured documentation at no cost. And we're happy to talk with any organization that, again, wants more information about that process. You will be receiving a request from one of our grant managers to share that certificate of insurance with us as part of getting the contract ready. One last note on insurance, you may utilize grant funds to maintain these coverages as long as it's built into your project budget. We'll talk a little bit later about project budgets, but worth noting here is that budgets can be changed. We have a method to make adjustments throughout the project as needed. Once contracts are fully executed, you're eligible for payment based on the terms of the contract. So what we're showing is the standard payment schedule, which calls for invoices to be submitted quarterly for reimbursement. If you would like to request a different payment structure, please let us know. For example, some projects are seasonal, and it may not make sense to spread payments out across an entire fiscal year. Or some organizations rely on the cash flow upfront in order to have the funds to conduct the work. So reimbursement might not work in every case. So we will, unless we hear otherwise, we'll start with this standard quarterly reimbursement structure, and know that we'll be as flexible as we can in helping you meet your needs. The scope of work in our contract is the place where we document the agreements that are specific to your project. Nearly everything else in the contract is boilerplate. That's sort of part of our template, where the scope of work is the section that's most custom and all about your work. When we develop the grant-related activities for your contract, we are in touch with you to provide a listing of the activities that would be funded. And we've asked for your input in proposing some performance measures that you can track to measure the results, and as well as an annual goal for each of those measures where possible. So definitely take a close look at the scope of work when you receive it. I think it's, I should have had this ready, but I think it's an appendix, or is it an appendix to the contract, Sarah? Is it at the end? Yes. Anyway, be on the lookout for the scope of work as part of your contract. And I might start sounding like a broken record, but please let us know if you see anything in there that you'd like to have adjusted. Here's where we jump over to reporting briefly. This is not your actual contract, but it's the method that we'll keep in touch throughout the year about your contract. So we are on a quarterly reporting schedule, regardless of where we landed for your payment structure. The quarterly reports are due the 15th of the month following the end of the quarter. So, for example, by October 15th, you'll send us a copy of your first quarter report for the fiscal year, covering July, August, and September. And we will provide this form to you. Once we've got all of your reporting measures and everything confirmed, we'll drop them in and send you your workbook. There's a tab for narrative. This is an opportunity for you to tell us how the project is going. We provide separate narrative boxes for each quarter so that reviewers of your report can see the cumulative year-to-date status updates. If they're opening the third quarter, they'll see everything from July forward, as an example. The narrative reporting has a limited number of characters, so you've got to be concise in here. It is a box in a workbook, and it doesn't have the most creative flexibility. However, you're welcome and even encouraged to attach additional materials as you wish. So if you have an annual report that came out that quarter, or you've got other information that you think it might be helpful for the committee or the public who might be following along, attach that to your email and we'll add that to your report for the quarter. We'll hold it in our files and also make it available as we publish these reports on the early childhood website for our funders and others who follow along with the work. After the narrative section, there's a numerical section. I'll describe this quickly, and I want to share about a change for this year. What you'll see in the numerical measures and results section on this tab is those performance measures from that you saw in the scope of work. With your help, we narrowed it down to just a few performance measures and that goal that we mentioned. So if, for example, if the measure is number of hours of training completed and you completed 20 in the first quarter and 30 more in the second quarter, you would add that up, and it's totaling as it goes and helping track progress toward your goal. There are some standardized measures. This is the change that there's some standardized measures for providers. Not everybody on this call is part of a project that would be classified as a provider, meaning early childhood classrooms. But for those that are, we do want to collect some information that allows us to get a snapshot of how it's going in the funded classrooms. Last year, or I guess the year that we're wrapping up right now, those questions were, or those data measures were in your results tab. They were things like attendance rates, turnover, enrollment, and demographics of the students that you're serving. Instead of having this as a quarterly reporting element, we're going to send you a survey, and we're developing that survey now, once at the beginning of the year and once at the end of the year, to collect this information. Hopefully it'll all be really readily accessible info that you're already collecting and reporting for NCD. Amy Berry just joined, and she knows I always struggle to say DCDEE when I put the NC, lots of letters. Point is, hopefully we're asking you for data that you're already collecting and don't find it burdensome to provide. We, through the survey, will get some information that's really helpful for our committee. Like I said, when looking at that whole portfolio level of the groups that they support through the Early Childhood Fund. Finally, on the reporting section, reporting workbook, there is a tab for the financials. And this is going to be the same regardless of whether you get the funds advanced to you or you're using this as your invoice. The tracking and reporting is the same. So you're letting us know over the 3-month period that you're reporting how much of the funds have been used based on your budget categories. So your starting budget will be filled in. We've worked with you to collect a starting budget, and you'll show us basically spending toward that. You don't need to submit every receipt at the time that you turn in these reports, or / invoices, depending on if this is also a draw request for you. We don't require receipts at each draw. We have a different method, which is contract monitoring, and I'll talk about that later, to ensure that that backup documentation is there. I wanted to quickly note before switching to contract monitoring about budget, that you have the opportunity at any time to request a budget change. Those that have done this with us before hopefully will find that it's fairly easy. If it's straightforward, you could send us an email with the reason for the change, the proposed change, and we're able to gather what we need and reply from there and give you the approval that you need in writing, and we're good to go. If it's something that you would rather talk through, you're considering different options, you want to explain something a little further, we could have a meeting together and talk about it. And then afterwards, we would still ask for that same email so that we've got a paper trail, something in writing saying we request to move this much from this line to this line. And then we save a copy when we reply to you and say approved. We save a copy in your contract files and encourage you to do the same. And then we will produce you an updated quarterly report template that has the updated starting budget or updated budget. I mentioned contract monitoring briefly. This comes later once projects are already implemented and active. However, since we're all together, we wanted to make sure to spend a little time at the beginning talking about contract monitoring. Essentially, this is a set of activities that we at Buncombe County undertake related to government grant funding to ensure that funds are being used for the public purpose that they've been granted for. They're properly being accounted for, and that progress is being made toward the goals. Staff conduct basic monitoring for contracts all year by doing activities like reviewing your quarterly reports and contacting you back when we have questions. And we also conduct a more in-depth type of contract monitoring, which is sometimes known as desk reviews. Not all organizations get one of these desk reviews or contract monitorings every year. We actually do these on a random sample. So that we over across the total portfolio, we're doing spot checks of how things are going. They entail an interview style meeting with questions related to the contract, on both the programmatic side as well as the financial side. And then we gather a set of follow-up documents to verify the reported information, and that might be programmatic or financial. So to give an example, we might ask for a policy or a procedure, a screenshot of a case management system, not with any client information, but just how you organize your information. We might ask for a sample form, a budget to actual report out of your QuickBooks or other financial system showing how the grant funds are treated. And we do this from a supportive perspective. Our intent is if we identify any areas for improvement, we offer those as recommendations and then work with you to try to find opportunities for that organizational strengthening, get you the resources and expertise and support you need to be as successful as you can in managing the public funds. Quickly wanting to name some common findings that can occur. I don't want to go into too much detail here, but for example, not having a method of linking expenses to the grant. We don't find this as much, honestly, for early childhood providers because of the strict systems and structures that your organizations tend to operate in, and the reporting that you need to do for many of the funders and other oversight organizations. And so this may go without saying to many of you, but it's necessary to treat grant funds, and this is a stipulation in the contract, as restricted. So the accounting system has to have a method such as fund accounting to link specific expenses to that specific grant rather than putting it into just like an overall grants fund at your organization. Receipts and backup documentation, making sure that those are all stored in a consistent way and are clearly marked. And backup documentation could be more than just receipts. It could be purchase orders or invoices or what have you. But again, that paper trail demonstrating that the funds were used for the public purpose that they were granted for. Needing to have organizational policies that apply to how you're using the funds. It says purchasing could be an example organizational policy. If you're depending on how the funds are being spent, if you're buying contracted services, having a written procedure for how you select contractors. If you're using funds for items that are held in inventory, I see inventory as an example in the screen for internal control. That might be another example where having a written policy or procedure for how inventory is tracked and managed would go along with what the grant is funding. Time and effort tracking, that's a term that you run into sometimes in the federal grant world, but if you're charging personnel to a grant, making sure that there's a clear method of how those hours worked and those personnel related expenses are assigned to the grant. So these are each deep areas that we could spend a lot of time on. Our intent was just to name some as examples so that later on in the year, the handful of the organizations on this call that get contacted by us and say, hey, we are reaching out to you for a contract monitoring. You've heard it before and you're prepared for what that will look like. Okay, I was just checking to see if this was still Rachel. So that's a run through of many of the areas in where we had common questions, but back to the contract itself. Because of where we are in time, it is June 27th and the fiscal year ends June 30th and the first day of your new grant year is July 1. So we want to be as ready to go as possible. Don't sweat it. If we sign, I'm doing my hand like it's a hand signed signature, but we can actually electronically sign now, which is great. Even if we sign in the middle of July, your period of performance for your grant will say July 1. So you'll be able to incur expenses and claim those costs all the way back to July 1. It's okay if we sign after the 1st of July, although of course we try to be as ready to go as we can, as close to that date as we can. When you receive your draft contract from us, please ask if you'd like to see any changes, if you'd like to discuss any of the items in the agreement. Once you're good with it, it says to return a signed notarized contract, and I believe that this is a slide that carried through from last year that's an error. Okay. Correct. Sarah, we know, great news. We no longer require notarized signatures. When I said electronic signatures are okay, you can sign in PDF using the PDF signature option and email it back to us. We don't have an actual electronic signature platform that we're using. But you can sign it on paper, scan it back. Certainly if you want to do hard copy signature and get it into us that way, we're flexible. So you'll reply to let us know if any changes are requested and you'll get that signed back to us. And you will submit the extra items that we mentioned in the email we need from you, your 990, your financial statements, your certificate of insurance. And I don't think anyone on this call needs new supplier forms to get registered. I think all the organizations here are good to go in that regard. So there's Angelyn Johnson's email address that we mentioned earlier. If you would like to attend the grantee workshop, it is on July 11th at 3 o'clock, and we would welcome you there. And of course, if you'd like to set up another time with your team, members of your team, we're happy to do that separately. So feel free to reach out anytime. I think what we'll do is drop the slides at this point and switch to the question and discussion portion of the agenda. Back to you, Sarah.
Great. I feel like I'm frozen on this. Okay, there we go. Thank you so much for going over all of those technical details, Rachel. I know that's a lot of information, and many of you are familiar with our processes at this point, but hopefully that was a good refresher and providing a little bit of new information and some new tools and resources for you this year. So I'm going to take a look now and see if we have any questions in our chat. If not, I welcome you all to drop questions in there or raise your hand on the Teams platform, and we can go ahead and answer some of those for you. Or just speak up.
I have a question. This is Davina from First and Sunshine Project. I was just wondering, if you get multi-year funding, do you have to keep reapplying every single year or updating things? How does it work for multi-year funding?
Multi-year funding is an option that the Early Childhood Committee has available to them and hasn't exercised very much. They are going to meet again. They have a subgroup that's working on the question of multi-year awards. If and when we're given multi-year grants, the recipient does not need to apply for that renewal. It will automatically renew. It's a little tricky because the county is still like really fiscal year oriented. So we end up looking at this 12-month time period with an automatic renewal of 1 or more years, depending on what the multi-year time period is. And there's usually a little caveat that says subject to budget availability and project performance. So as long as the Early Childhood Fund is still there, and given the change that the Board of Commissioners recently made to establish it as a standalone fund, prospects look good for its stability. As long as that fund is still there and commissioners are still making their investments in it, and the project is performing or making reasonable progress toward the goals, then it just automatically renews. We'd like to see more multi-year, and it's tricky. The committee has a lot of different factors to take into consideration when making those decisions.
Thank you, Rachel.
And I think at this point, the majority of folks have received a draft of their contract. I know some of you have already returned signed copies, so thank you so much for being on that. But as Rachel mentioned, if you have any questions or need any changes, definitely look through that scope of work section of your contract. Look through the project activities and the performance measures, make sure that those align with what you intend to do with your project. And the sooner that we can get those back, the sooner we can get them through our process here and get them fully executed and start the projects.
I'll use this opportunity to make an editorial comment about budget adjustments. Given that this year we have a cohort of early childhood grantees that each got 100% of their request, that's a really fortunate position to be in, and it's going to come with needing the added responsibility of needing to pay close attention as we get in further into the year on how spending is tracking. what's your quote unquote burn rate on each of your lines, we will look halfway through the year and see which projects are more or less 50% or more spent, and initiate conversations with you about what might be going differently than planned. Maybe there was a position that took longer to fill, or maybe there were purchases that you had to plan to make that were on back order, or whatever it is that changed. As long as the request for a budget adjustment still helps accomplish the same goal and is allowable expense, we tend to be really open to those budget adjustments. You're not locked into the original plan, and it is just going to naturally happen in the course of a year. That your best guess, when were these applications due? Like initially in February of 2023, for how things are really going to play out in June of 2024, there's going to be some change. So encourage you to keep a close eye on that spending and keep an open line of communication with us. Certainly funds can be returned if they're not needed, but there's usually other options for related uses that we can look at first.
Any other questions? All right, and if you have questions that you didn't want to share with the group today, feel free to reach out to myself or Rachel or Angela, and we're happy to respond to an email or jump on a call. We hope to be as accessible and supportive as possible in this process. So I guess we can wrap up early. Thank you all so much for joining today. I really appreciate your ability to take the time to make it to the session, and all that you do in our community. It's really amazing and so important. So we look forward to continuing to work with you on this year's grants.
Thanks, everyone. Great to see you.